Hi there, this is David McKnight. Thank you for joining me for this exclusive Power of Zero presentation. Grateful that you're with us today. Now, some of the things I'm going to talk about today were urgent and relevant prior to the COVID-19 reality, but now that the COVID-19 reality is upon us, I would say that everything we're going to talk about today is even more amplified and even more enhanced. So let's jump right into this. I'm going to start off with a quiz. By the way, this is normally when I do this live and in person. It's a very interactive presentation. We don't have that luxury today, but I'm still going to ask some questions and try to maintain a dialogue with you. So let's start off with this quiz. What's the highest marginal tax bracket in the history of our country? What's the worst it's ever been? Well, the last 2 years of World War II, the highest marginal tax bracket was 94%, and that was for any dollar you made above and beyond $200,000. Now, $200,000 back then was a pretty big deal. It was about $3.2 million in today's dollars. Can you even think of anybody back then that made that type of money? Well, there was an actor who later became a politician. Can you think of who that was? Well, his name was Ronald Reagan. And if you study Reagan's biography, he talks about how he never made more than 2 movies in a year. Reason being, he made about $100,000 per movie, and any dollar he made above and beyond $200,000, he only kept 6 cents on the dollar. Truth be told, he didn't even get to keep the 6 cents. Who do you think got the 6 cents? That's right, the state of California to pay for state tax. So it literally did not pay for Ronald Reagan to work past the month of June so that he would take the rest of the year off. He'd go to his ranch, he'd ride horses, he'd start making movies again January 1st the following year. So let's fast forward to the decade of the 70s. What was the worst federal marginal tax bracket you could pay throughout the entire decade of the 70s? Well, this is easy to remember. Throughout the entire decade of the 70s, the worst federal marginal tax bracket you could pay was, that's right, 70%. Once again, for any dollar you made above and beyond $200,000. Now let's fast forward to today. What is the worst federal marginal tax bracket you can pay today? The tax rate at which Bill Gates pays taxes on most of his earned income? That's only 37%. So here's my question for you, and this is not a trick question. How does 37% stack up against some of these tax rates we experienced in the past? Historically low, you might be thinking. Well, it's true. These tax rates aren't low, and it's interesting you might think that because, like I said, I do this workshop in the pre-COVID-19 world 90 times a year, live and in person, and I routinely would ask rooms full of people, how bad are taxes today? And what do you think they say? They say, terrible, horrible, as bad as they've ever been. What's the truth? The truth is that tax rates, like I said, are just about as low as we've seen in our lifetime. However, something is going to happen to that tax bracket January 1st, 2026. Is it going to go up or down? It's going to go up. It's going to go up to 39.6. And guess what, folks? In order for that to happen, all Congress has to do is nothing. Is Congress pretty good at doing nothing? You bet. Well, is 39.6 enough to keep me awake at night? Well, 39.6 is what tax rates were throughout the entire decade of the 90s. Anybody remember how the stock market was doing in the 90s? It was doing great. In fact, if you dropped $100,000 into the S&P 500 in 1990, took a nap for 9 years, woke up in 1999, you want to know what that money would have been worth? $600,000. So your money would have sextupled during the decade of the 90s alone, and that's under these kind of tax rates. So again, not enough to keep me awake at night. The real question I have for you, however, is this. What is likely to happen to tax rates as we move forward in time to 2026, 2028, and 2030 and beyond? What does your gut tell you? Are tax rates down the road likely to be higher or lower than 39.6? Well, for those of you who think higher, my question for you is why? What will we be spending money on as a country that could literally force tax rates to go up? What are the big ticket items? Well, let's talk about it. We got debt. We just blew past $25 trillion of debt. That's a 2 and a 5 followed by 12 zeros. We've got Medicare, Medicaid. We've got Social Security, the CARES Act. That's the stimulus spending for COVID-19. That was $2.2 trillion. Experts say that by the end of 2020, our fiscal deficit will be $3.7 trillion. Our normal fiscal deficit is about $1 trillion. We did 4 times that amount in just 1 year, or we will have done at least. Pensions. The other day, I was talking to a lady, and she said, I asked her, I said, hey, what happens to your pension if your company goes broke? And she says, don't worry. No matter what happens to my company, the federal government guarantees I will always receive 2/3 of my pension every year till I die. Folks, that's what we call an unfunded obligation. What's an unfunded obligation? It's a promise the federal government's made that they can't afford to keep. Some experts say that the amount of money the federal government has promised that they can't afford to keep is about 120 trillion, but there's actually a very famous economist out of Boston University, Dr. Larry Kotlikoff. He's the foremost expert on what we call fiscal gap accounting. What happens with fiscal gap accounting is he projects out over the next 75 years everything we promised to pay for Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, interest on the national debt, and he projects out over that same time period everything that we can afford to deliver under today's tax rates. And he says if there's a difference between those two numbers, that's what's called a fiscal gap. And that's your true national debt. He then takes that number and he figures out the net present value calculation. He says, how much money would we have to have sitting in a bank account today earning treasury rates to be able to deliver on all those promises? He says the true national debt is not 25 trillion. It's not even 120 trillion. It's much closer to 239 trillion. And that was before all this stimulus spending on COVID-19. And the list goes on, folks. Cost of defending our country, healthcare, welfare. But if you had to pick two things on this list that will make debt go up more than any two other things in the mid to long term, which two would you pick? Well, if you picked Medicare and Social Security, you'd be absolutely correct. Let's see if we can wrap our brains around why. I'm going to open up a brief parenthesis just on Social Security alone. Again, a little quiz here. Any idea when Social Security was first established? Well, they rolled it out as a linchpin of the New Deal in 1935. It was the hallmark of the Roosevelt administration. When they started things out, there were 42 workers putting money in for every one person that took money out. And back then, how old did you have to be to draw on Social Security? Well, you didn't qualify till age 65. Well, anybody have any idea on the average life expectancy back then? It was only 62. They didn't even anticipate that the average person would live long enough to ever draw on Social Security. If you were lucky enough to make it to 65, how long did you draw on Social Security before you tipped over dead? Only 2 years. So in summary, when Social Security first started out, you had all these people putting money in, hardly anybody taking money out. And when they took it out for 2 years, then they died. Was Social Security pretty solvent when it first started out? You bet it was. It was set up to last forever. And then something happened. Soldiers came home from World War II and they started to do something at a rate at which they'd never done it before. What did they start doing? That's right. They started to have babies. In fact, if you look at demographic trends over the last century or so, we basically have 5 generations. We start off at the turn of the century with what we call the Henry Ford generation. These are our World War II vets. What did Tom Brokaw call these folks? That's right, the greatest generation. They were followed up by what we call the silent generation, still sort of reeling from the Great Depression. And then what do we call this big statistical anomaly in the middle here? Well, we call these the baby boomers. So as it turns out, my mom was one of the very first baby boomers. She was born January 17th, 1946. And the last baby boomer was born in 1964. So we had 18 years of unprecedented procreation. Today we have 78 million baby boomers in our country, single largest voting bloc. They determine every election. So they had children of their own. We call that Generation X. I am a Generation Xer. And then we had children of our own. We call this Generation Y. I got 7 kids. That's exactly what I asked myself in the middle of the night. Now, as you look at this chart, did baby boomers, these folks in the middle here, have nearly as many children as their parents did? And the answer is no. They had almost 30 million fewer children. So if you were to ask yourself today, how many workers are putting money into Social Security for every one person that takes money out? What does that ratio look like today? Well, it's a little bit less than 3 to 1. And in another 10 years, it's going to be much closer to 2 to 1. And what's the earliest you can draw on Social Security today? Well, you can actually start drawing at age 62. And if you start at 62, how long will you continue to draw before you tip over dead? Well, you know, a lot of times when we think about life expectancy in our country, the number 77 or 78 pops up, and that actually is average life expectancy. But that includes infant mortality and all the bad things that can happen to you up until the age 62. The truth is that if you make it to 62 and start drawing on Social Security, you will continue to draw on Social Security on average until age 85. So 23 years. So folks, is Social Security today just a little bit different than when it first started out? You bet. It was started off as insurance against living too long, and it slowly morphed into a pension program that covers us for nearly a quarter of our lives. Well, how many of you guys have heard of a guy named David Walker? David Walker is a personal hero of mine. He's former comptroller general of the federal government. He did that for 10 years under Bush and Clinton. Centrist, tell it like it is sort of a guy, very good at math. And he was the head of the Government Accountability Office. He was on the board of Social Security. He was basically the CPA of the USA. The reason I tell you this is because David Walker knows more about these numbers than just about anyone else on the planet. And when he took one look at the books, he said, hey, we have promised way more than we can afford to deliver. He says, you think Social Security is bad? He says, Medicare is 5 times more expensive. He said, to be able to deliver on these 2 promises alone, he said this in 2008, we would have to double taxes immediately. He says, you don't have to double taxes immediately, but for every year that you postpone doubling taxes, the national debt will grow by $2 trillion per year, each and every year, until we hit this magical moment in our country when we have $53 trillion of debt. So here's my question for you. What's wrong with a country that has $53 trillion of debt, or is everything peachy keen? Well, did you know that if we had $53 trillion of debt, that all of the revenue flowing into the U.S. Treasury at that point would only be enough to pay the interest on all that debt, let alone any principal, let alone a single dollar for Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, or anything else we listed up on the screen. David Walker was so concerned about this that in 2008 he resigned and started to crisscross the country, raising the warning cry to whoever would listen. And in 2010, he wrote a book called Come Back America, in which he diagnosed the problem. And he appeared on NPR to talk about his book, and he told the radio show hostess, he said, hey, look, tax rates have to double or we're going to go broke. And she didn't believe him. So he says, look, I can give you one 4-letter word to explain why tax rates have to double. And she couldn't guess what it was. So they opened up the phone lines and people started to call in, and nobody could guess the 4-letter word that explained why tax rates have to double. They heard debt. That was the number one guess. They heard jobs, wars, kids, fear. One guy even said health. Well, what is that 4-letter word that explains why tax rates have to double? It's math. What does David Walker mean by math? Basically what he's saying, look, if this is what you're spending, but this is what's coming in, you either have to double what's coming in, cut in half what's going out, or some combination of the two. I remember I was given the same presentation 2 days before midterm elections in 2009 in a little city called Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. When I was done with my presentation, everyone came up to me and they said, Dave, who should we vote for? Who should we vote for? And I never felt so powerful. And I said, you know what? It doesn't matter who you vote for, because whoever gets elected is going to inherit a math problem, the solution to which involves either doubling taxes, reducing spending by half, or some combination of the two. All right, folks, let's get serious. How many of you watch cartoons? Well, how many of you guys have ever seen the Roadrunner? I know some of you were weaned on the Roadrunner. Well, who is always trying to kill the Roadrunner? That's right, Wile E. Coyote. Well, a couple of years ago, I was watching the Roadrunner, and I was with my kids, and in this particular episode, the coyote was trying to kill the Roadrunner, and he was building a bomb with which to do so. And what company makes his bombs? That's right, Acme. He was building a bomb made by Acme inside a shed that was also made by Acme, and he was so focused and intent on finishing this bomb that he didn't realize that the Roadrunner had pushed his shed onto a train track. Maybe you've seen the episode. And he was so intent and focused on finishing this bomb that he also didn't realize until the last possible moment that there was a huge freight train bearing down on him. Now, a very important question, most important question I'm going to ask today. If you found yourselves on a train track with a huge freight train bearing down on you, what would you do? Well, it's easy. You'd jump off, you'd haul yourself to safety. You get off the tracks, right? Well, let's go back to the coyote. The coyote sees this huge freight train bearing down on him, and instead of jumping out of the way, what does he do? He simply pulls down the window shade, thinking that the act of doing so would make the problem go away. Did the problem go away? No, there's a huge explosion. Does the coyote ever really die? No, it's frustrating, but as the smoke and fire cleared away, you could see him sort of limping off screen, very much the worse for wear. Well, folks, why did we gather here today to talk about the Roadrunner? Well, as Americans who do most of our saving for retirement and what we call tax-deferred vehicles like 401ks and IRAs, we have a very real freight train that's bearing down on us, and it's bearing down on us in the form of what? Higher taxes. And we got a couple of choices of what we can do about it. We can pretend like the problem doesn't really exist. We can pretend like the math to which David Walker referred doesn't really add up, but isn't that a little bit like pulling down the window shade? Or we can implement some strategies starting this year to help remove us from the train tracks, thereby insulating and buffering us from the impact of higher taxes. So what we're going to do in the balance of our time is we're going to talk about some of those strategies you can use starting right now to get yourself off the tracks. Now, we're going to jump into a purely hypothetical scenario that talks about Mr. and Mrs. Jones. They're both age 50. Between the two of them, they make $100,000 per year, and they want to retire at age 65. Now, you got to remember that there are literally millions of different types of investments out there. There's all sorts of different ways to save money for retirement, but I'm here to tell you that no matter where you invest those retirement dollars, all of those investments fit into basically only 3 types of accounts. How's that for easy? There's only 3 types of accounts within which to save money for retirement. Today, we're going to talk about these accounts in terms of buckets of money and show you how they relate to Mr. and Mrs. Jones. Now, let's start off with the taxable bucket. These, with the taxable investments, every year as your money grows, you get to pay a tax. These are going to be things like CDs, money markets, stocks, bonds, mutual funds. How can you tell if you have a taxable investment? Well, every year at the end of the year, the financial institution sends you that little love letter. It's called a 1099. It says, hey, your money grew this much. Now you got to give a portion of the money back to the IRS in the form of taxes. So generally speaking, the growth on the money in this bucket is 100% taxable. Well, if that's the case, why do we have these types of investments? We have them because generally speaking, they're very liquid, which means you can get your hands on it. You can convert it to cash, which means that they make for great emergency funds. How much money do financial experts tell us we should have in emergency funds? 6 months, like the one number they can agree upon, 6 months were the basic living expenses. Having said that, can you have too much money in this bucket? Absolutely. We see it all the time. See that couple who lived through the Depression. They shuffle into my office. They say, Dave, we got 9 CDs for $100,000 each sitting in 9 different banks, and we think we may be paying too much in tax. Are they paying too much in tax? Absolutely, because you can have too much money in this bucket. So the moral of the story when it comes to this bucket is you can have too much money in this bucket from a tax efficiency perspective, but you can have not enough from an emergency fund perspective. So what we're looking for in this bucket is just the right amount, and just the right amount is about 6 months worth of basic living expenses. That second bucket we talked about is the tax deferred bucket, meaning you don't pay tax on this money as your money grows. When do you pay the tax? That's right, at the very end when you take the money out. These are common investments like IRAs, 401ks, 457s, 403bs, SEP Simples. You guys get the idea. Now, there's all sorts of different rules that apply to these investments, but generally speaking, they all have 2 things in common. The first thing they have in common is, generally speaking, when you put money in, tax deduction. So, for example, if you make $100,000 per year and you put $10,000 into your 401k, your new adjusted gross income is $90,000. The second thing they have in common is the manner in which they're taxed upon distribution. Now, the IRS has a special word that they use to characterize this income when you take it out. They call it ordinary income. So what does that mean? That means that when you put money in, all you really did was defer the receipt of that income until some point much further down the road. And at what rate are you going to be taxed? Whatever tax rates happen to be in the year you take that money out. So folks, that's like going into a business partnership. And every year your business partner gets to vote on what percentage of your profits they get to keep. How much money do you really have in that IRA or 401k? Well, it's hard to say unless you can accurately predict what tax rates are going to be in the year you take that money out. The third bucket we talk about is what we call the tax-free bucket. Now, there's 2 things that I'm looking for in a true tax-free investment. The first thing I'm looking for is it's got to be truly tax-free. When I say truly tax-free, I'm talking free from federal tax, free from state tax, and free from capital gains tax. The second thing I'm looking for in a true tax-free investment is distributions from a true tax-free investment should not count as provisional income. What does that mean? Well, provisional income is the income the IRS keeps track of to determine if they're going to tax your Social Security. Guess what, folks? Any 1099s out of your taxable bucket count as provisional income. Any distributions at all from your tax-deferred bucket count as provisional income, and 1/2 of your Social Security counts as provisional income, and the IRS adds all this provisional income up, and if it's a single person, it adds up to more than $34,000, or if a married couple, it adds up to more than $44,000, then get this, up to 85% of your Social Security becomes taxable to you at your highest marginal tax bracket. So true tax-free investment, free from all kinds of tax, and does not count as provisional income. So now that we know that these 3 buckets exist, let's talk about Mr. and Mrs. Jones' profile. They've got $500,000 in some in their joint and their cumulative IRAs. They've got $100,000 in the plain old taxable mutual funds. That's their emergency fund. They're putting 10% into their 401k, and they're getting no match, no free money. They're paying $2,000 per year for some term life insurance, and they're paying $4,000 per year for some long-term care insurance. Well, if this couple were to walk into a traditional tax-deferred Paradigm Financial Advisor's office, how would the conversation go? Well, just so happens I've been training traditional tax-deferred financial advisors for the last 15 years of my life, and in the act of doing so, I have sat in their office and I've listened to them as they've spoken to people like this for the very first time. And here's how the conversation goes. Mr. and Mrs. Jones, congratulations. They always congratulate you. You've done a great job saving money in this IRA. Problem is, last year when you were down the road at XYZ company, you only earned 7%. We think we can get you 8%, so roll all that money over to us. As far as your mutual funds go, that's a great emergency fund. Problem is, last year down the road, you only earned 3%. We think we can get you 5%, so let us manage that for you as well. As far as your 401k with no match goes, keep on doing it. When you switch jobs, give me a call. We'll roll the 401k into the IRA, get everything under one roof, maybe save you some breakpoints, save you some fees. And as far as your term life insurance and long-term care insurance goes, gosh, not really what we do, but who are we to say you shouldn't keep doing it? And that is a conversation that I've heard literally dozens and dozens of times. Well, when someone like this walks into my office for the very first time, I see red flags all over the place. For example, I'm not so much concerned with what's in this IRA today. What keeps me awake at night is what this IRA is going to be worth 15 years from now if it grows at 8% per year. 15 years from now at 8% per year, it's going to be worth $1.6 million. Folks, what's wrong with having $1.6 million in your tax-deferred bucket? Well, did you know that if you had $1.6 million in your tax-deferred bucket, that required minimum distributions alone would put you in one of the higher marginal federal tax brackets and literally guarantee that your Social Security will be taxable in perpetuity with all of the compensating spend down that goes along with it? So what we want to do is we want to prevent that IRA from ever getting to 1.6 million. And how can we prevent that IRA from growing? Well, one of the things we might recommend is to do a Roth conversion. A Roth conversion basically says if you have money sitting in your tax-deferred bucket in the form of an IRA, you can shift it to tax-free so long as you pay what along the way? Taxes. At what rate? Whatever the rate happens to be in the year you do the conversion. So let's say they do it all in 1 year. I'm not recommending this. Let's just say that they did and paid 40% tax. Tax would they owe on that conversion? Well, $200,000. So here's my question for you. Do Mr. and Mrs. Jones have $200,000 just lying around that they can earmark for this tax bill? And the answer is no, they don't have it. Well, some people say that's okay. They don't need to have it. Why not just have the IRS withhold it right out of the conversion, pay the tax? Well, what would happen if you did that? Well, if you're younger than 59 and a half, you get even if you charge you a temporary. So you get a lot of money just in your taxable bucket that you tax on that 59 and a half until you. Is there any other way to get money out of that IRA pre-59? Section 72, should we call it A? Pre-59 and a half without that lasts for at least years or until 50 days by way of a 72. Mr. and Mrs. Jones, $25,000 tax-free. By the way, if we want $25,000 right out of the $25,000 itself. All right, let's take a look at these mutual funds. If this is their emergency fund, how do we feel about it? Do they have too much or too little in those emergency funds? Well, if they make $100,000 per year, how much should they have in their emergency fund? Well, I'd say $50,000. So not only do they have too much, but they're growing into mutual funds, which means the problem's getting bigger every year. So what we want to do is we want to take the growth on that mutual fund plus some of the principal, shift it from taxable to tax-free, little by little, year by year, such that by the time they reach 65, they've got the perfect amount. I've done the math on that. That would require an annual shift from taxable to tax-free of $6,000 per year. All right, how do we feel about 401ks that don't have matches? Should we do them, folks? This is the one thing that Susie Orman, Dave Ramsey, and Clark Howard actually agree upon. The rule of thumb when it comes to 401ks is you put in up to the match, but not one penny above and beyond. You do whatever's required to get the free money, and then you move on to the next best thing. Well, if these folks are trying to prevent their IRA from growing by doing a 72T, yet they're putting money hand over fist into their 401k and they're getting no free money, are those two strategies at odds with each other? You bet they are. So what we want to do is we want to recapture that 10%. What's 10% of their joint salaries of $100,000? It's $10,000. We want to shift that to tax-free. How do we feel about term life insurance and long-term care insurance? We feel like it's incredibly important to mitigate both of those risks, either one of which can really upset your financial apple cart. But we feel like sometimes, not always, sometimes there can be a better way to accomplish that. So we may recapture that money as well. So what does that all add up to? $47,000. And usually right about now, someone will say, Dave, not so fast. You don't really have $47,000. And I'll say, why not? And I'll say, because some of those recommendations are actually taxable events. And it's true that 72T is a taxable event. And when you put less money into your 401k, that increases your taxable income. So that's also a taxable event. So the question is, how much additional taxation are they going to experience because of this strategy? Well, $35,000 of additional taxable income, let's call it 30% tax. That's $10,500 of additional taxes every year that they do this strategy. Let me ask you this. Do Mr. and Mrs. Jones have $10,500 just lying around that they would love to earmark for this tax bill? Not that they would love. And if we say, quit going out to eat, quit going on vacation, pull back the belt a couple of notches just so you can pay that tax bill, will they return my phone call? Probably not. So what I would suggest is that they pay that tax bill right out of the $47,000 that we just freed up, which means we really have $36,500 per year to reposition to tax-free. So folks, this is where the rubber hits the road. Where can we put $36,500 per year such that it grows in a truly tax-free way? Well, at this point, I may bring up one of my very favorite tax-free investments, and that's what we call a Roth IRA. How much money can two 50-year-olds put into Roth IRAs these days? $7,000 each for a total of $14,000 per year. Why do I love Roth IRAs so much? I love Roth IRAs so much because they're truly tax-free. So long as you're 59 and a half when you take the money out, you don't pay any of those taxes we talked about. And when you take money out of your Roth IRA, it does not count as provisional income. It does not count against the thresholds which cause Social Security taxation. Roth IRAs are truly tax-free. And when I say Roth IRA, folks, I'm talking any investment with the word Roth in front of it. It could be a Roth IRA, Roth 401k, Roth conversion. They are all truly tax-free. So we fully fund, which leaves us with $22,500 per year. Folks, where can we put $22,500 per year such that it grows in a truly tax-free way? Well, at this point, I may bring up a bucket of money that gets treated differently for tax purposes than anything else we've talked about so far. And what happens with this bucket is you put money in, and as your money grows, your bucket begins to fill. Only the IRS says the growth on the money in this bucket is going to be treated under a different section of the IRS tax code than anything else we've talked about so far. What does that section of the IRS tax code say? It says that you can touch this money pre-59 and a half with no penalty. Can you do that in your IRA or 401k? No, you cannot. They're going to tell you that as your money grows, you receive no 1099s. What does that mean? That means no tax as your money grows. They're also going to tell you that when you take the money out, if you take it out the right way, it does not show up as reportable income on your tax return. What does that mean? That means it's tax-free and does not count as provisional income. They're also going to tell you that there are no contribution limits. What do we say with the contribution limits of the Roth IRA? $7,000 each for a total of $14,000. Folks, I've got clients that do $50 a month, and I've got clients that do $200,000 per year, and everywhere in between, there are no limits on how much you can put into this bucket. They're also going to tell you that there are no income limitations. Let me ask you this. Can Bill Gates do a Roth IRA? No, he cannot. He makes too much money. You start making north of $206,000 of modified adjusted gross income, you can no longer do a Roth IRA. They're also going to tell you that if history serves as a model, there may be no legislative risk. And all that means is that if history serves as a model, if they were to ever change this bucket, whoever has the bucket gets to keep it and continue to put money into it under the old rule for the rest of their lives. We call that a grandfather clause. Well, usually right about now, people say, well, gosh, Dave, this is like the alignment of the stars. Why not just put all my money into this bucket? Well, first of all, is it ever a good idea to put all your eggs into any one basket? And the answer is no. Not only that, the IRS says if we're going to give you the benefit of an unlimited bucket of a nearly unlimited bucket of tax-free dollars, we're going to that there be a cost of admission. We're going to require that attached to the side of that bucket through which flows on a monthly basis some expenses. And what do those expenses go towards? They go towards some administrative fees, but they primarily go towards the cost of term life insurance. Well, let me ask you this, folks. If your house is paid off, your kids have moved out, and you're rapidly approaching retirement, is term life insurance really high on your wish list? No, it's usually right about now that people start dumping their term life insurance, and the companies that sponsor these programs recognize that, so they've done something to sweeten the pot. They simply say that in the event that somewhere down the road you should need long-term care, they will give you your death benefit while you're alive for the purpose of paying for it. Here's an example. Let's say you got a death benefit of $400,000. You wake up one day, you can no longer feed yourself, bathe yourself, transfer yourself, what have you, any 2 of 6 activities of daily living. You can find one doctor to write one letter to that effect. They will start sending you 25% of that death benefit, or $100,000 per year every year for 4 years for the purpose of paying for long-term care. Now, they may discount that number slightly based on your age in which you receive the benefit, but the point is this: they're willing to give you your death benefit while you're alive for the purpose of paying for long-term care. Let me ask you this. How many of you guys have looked into traditional long-term care insurance? Is it cheap? No. It's getting more and more expensive all the time. Is it hard to qualify? You bet. You might live to be 120, but if you have a bad back, a bad hip, a bad knee, you may not even get accepted. And what happens if you pay for 30 years and die peaceful in your sleep, never having used it? Do they send you all your money back at the end? No. It goes to pay for someone else's benefit. And that can be a source of heartburn for a lot of different people, because nobody wants to pay for something they hope they never have to use. Why is this different? This is different because if you die peaceful in your sleep 30 years from now, never having needed long-term care, guess what? Someone's still getting a death benefit. So there isn't that sensation of having paid for something you hope you never have to use. By the way, have Mr. and Mrs. Jones, the couple we've been talking about, have they already bought off on the idea that they need term insurance and long-term care? You bet. They've already budgeted for it. So all we're suggesting is that maybe in some circumstances, maybe not send that off to an insurance company in the form of a premium payment, recapture it, stuff it into their bucket, and let just a portion of it drip out in the form of expenses. And now they can take advantage of a nearly unlimited bucket of tax-free dollars that wasn't previously available to them. Folks, what do we call this bucket? Chapter 5 of my book, The Power of Zero. We call it the LIRP. What does that stand for? Life Insurance Retirement Plan. Why life insurance? Because the IRS says in order for this bucket to work, you got to be willing to pay for some life insurance. You got to have a need for life insurance. Why retirement plan? Because one of the ancillary goals of this bucket is to build money up so that somewhere down the road you can take money out and spend it on your lifestyle at a period in time when tax rates are likely to be dramatically higher than they are today. All right, before we go any further, I've got a very important question to ask, and it's simply this. If you could be in any tax bracket of your choosing, in retirement, which tax bracket would you choose? Well, if you know the name of my book, The Power of Zero, you can probably guess my favorite tax bracket is 0%. Well, if what we're shooting for is the 0% tax bracket for Mr. and Mrs. Jones, tell me how we're doing so far. They're going to have money coming out of their Roth IRA. So long as they're 59 and a half when they take the money out, will they pay tax? No tax. They're going to have a lot of money coming out of their LIRP, regardless of how old they are when they take the money out. Will they pay tax? No tax. Now, remember that IRA? Let's go back to that IRA. The goal in doing the 72T was simply to prevent that IRA from getting any bigger. Well, if we did a good job of preventing that IRA from getting any bigger, how much money will they still have in that IRA by the time they reach 65? $500,000. Well, if that's the case, is there any way to get money out of that IRA, spend it on their lifestyle, not pay tax, and it's got to be legal? Well, remember, when you retire, absent any other deductions, the IRS gives you a deduction. They call that a standard deduction. And historically, they've indexed that to keep up with inflation. So by the time Mr. and Mrs. Jones reach 65, they're going to have closer to $38,800 of deductions. So here's my question for you. If at age 65 they have $38,800 of deductions, how much could they take out of that IRA without paying any tax at all? You got it, $38,800. Moral of the story, so long as you only take out up to whatever your standard deduction happens to be in any given year, you now have an IRA that's 100% tax-free. And by the way, if we have no tax, and we can stay below our provisional income thresholds, what do you suppose happens to their Social Security? No tax. And if you have no tax, what tax bracket does that put you in? 0%. Folks, why do I make such a big deal about being in the 0% tax bracket? Well, if we can't get you to the 0% tax bracket, what's the next best tax bracket? Don't anyone say one? That's right, 10%. Throw another 6% for state. Now we're talking 16%. If what David Walker says comes true and tax rates have to double to keep our country solvent, now we're talking 32%. All of a sudden, second place isn't looking all that great. Now, I love it when things make sense conceptually, but I love it even more when things make sense mathematically. So what I did for these folks is what we call a before and after comparison. I simply said, if Mr. and Mrs. Jones had never met me and they kept on doing exactly what they were doing and they didn't change a thing, how much money would they be able to spend after tax? And according to my math, based on 30% tax rates, they'd be able to spend just shy of $4.5 million after tax. I know what you're thinking. That sounds like a lot of money. It is a lot of money. The problem is they run out of money at age 85. Conversely, if they do everything we talked about today, implemented all of the strategies, got to the 0% tax bracket, got their Social Security tax-free, they spend nearly $8 million. They never run out of money. They still have $1.4 million left over at age 100. People say, Dave, why such a big difference between these two comparisons? And I say, guess what? When you make little tiny tweaks at age 50 and you amortize those tweaks out over a lifetime, there can be a massive quantum difference on the back end. Now, more importantly, what happens to the gray column if tax rates double? Does it get bigger or smaller? It gets smaller. What happens to the blue column if tax rates double? It stays exactly the same. Why? Because if you're in the 0% tax bracket and tax rates double, 2 times 0 is still 0. Folks, that is what we call the power of zero. Now, usually at this point, I get a couple of different questions. The most popular question by far is, hey, Dave, am I too old to get to the 0% tax bracket? And I usually like to respond to that question in the following way. Throughout 2018, filmmaker Doug Orchard and I crisscrossed the country filming a documentary, interviewing experts on the future of tax rates as it relates to the national debt. Take a listen to what they had to say.
The truth is the federal government has lost control of the budget.
Instead of paying for all the new initiatives, whether they're tax cuts, spending increases, all sorts of things that we like, the government's just putting it all on the national credit card. And as a result, our national debt is just going up and up and up. And it's growing faster than the economy, and that's when you know you have a real problem.
Everything is going to be squeezed out of the budget. There won't be anything left.
The road we are on is a perilous one that ultimately leads to the bankrupting of our country.
So we have a crisis on our hands.
All Congress has to do for this whole situation to come to a head is nothing. Because every year that they do nothing makes the problem even more unsolvable.
We don't seem to have the ability to get along and find common ground.
Is the government trying to trick you right now? And the answer is very simply yes.
So why is this being swept under the rug? Why is nobody talking about this?
Probably because it's not popular.
So I've actually been traveling around the country for about 4 years now, taking the Power of Zero message to different groups.
When you cut taxes on current generations, you are simultaneously raising them on future generations.
It is all driven by spending. Once we have spent a dollar, we've already decided to tax it. The only question is whether we tax it now or we borrow it now and tax it in the future.
So to make up for the liabilities that we're incurring with all the promises we've made in social insurance programs, we're going to have to increase substantially the tax rate and perhaps even double it.
Now, precisely how high it's going to be, there's a lot of room to debate, but people will have to pay more taxes.
People's retirement savings are at risk of future higher taxes.
Well, qualified plans really do two things. They defer the tax and the tax calculation. Now let that run past your brain real slow.
I'm driven by trying to help as many people as I can avoid this disaster that's going to come up in retirement when taxes go up and the market goes down. What are these people going to do if they haven't planned ahead of time?
So all these people, all these experts are reading the same music and they're all singing the same song. They're basically saying, hey, look, if we don't change course dramatically as a country, that 10 years from now, tax rates will have to rise dramatically or we go broke as a country. Some of these experts even use the D word as it relates to the future of tax rates. What's the D word? Tax rates will have to double. to keep our country solvent. So the real question in my mind is not, are you too old to get to the 0% tax bracket? It's this: if 2030 rolls around and tax rates double, will you look back on the year 2020 and say, why did I not take advantage of tax rates while they were historically low? Because all tax rates have to do in the future is go by 1% for the math here to make sense. A second question I get is, can I be in the 0% tax bracket and still be a good person? After all, if we're all in the 0% tax bracket, who's going to pay for the roads? Who's going to pay for the schools? Who's going to pay for the social programs? Well, first of all, are we asking Mr. and Mrs. Jones here not to pay tax? No, the cost of admission to get to the 0% tax bracket is you got to be willing to pay a tax. We're simply suggesting that when given the choice between paying taxes at today's historically low tax rates or postponing the payment of those taxes till some point much further down the road, you're probably better off paying them today. Question number 3, hey, Dave, how come I've never heard of this stuff before? Well, I would submit that you've heard of just about everything we've talked about today. Maybe not quite in this combination, but you've heard about just about everything. The only thing that may be new for some people is this idea of the LIRP, and all we're doing with the LIRP is the opposite of what most people do when it comes to life insurance. What do most people do when it comes to life insurance? They get as much death benefit as they can for as little money as possible. Here we're doing just the opposite. We're getting as little death benefit as the IRS requires of us, and we're stuffing as much money into it as the IRS allows in an attempt to mimic all of the tax-free benefits of the Roth IRA without any of the limitations of the Roth IRA. All right, folks, for those of you who are taking some notes, I got a couple of takeaways for you. Takeaway number 1, tax rates in the future are likely to be dramatically higher than they are today. Folks, the train left the station. There's no turning back. Tax rates will be higher in the future than they are today. The math bears that out. Takeaway number 2, the only way to truly insulate yourself from the impact of higher taxes is to get to the 0% tax bracket. Why? Because if you're in the 0% tax bracket and tax rates double, what's 2 times 0? It's still 0. Takeaway number 3, I've been doing this for over 20 years. I've helped put thousands of Americans on the road to the 0% tax bracket, and I noticed something very interesting. It is nearly impossible to get to the 0% tax bracket by relying on just one stream of income, stream of tax-free income, that is. You can't get there just by contributing to a Roth IRA. You can't get there just by owning an LIRP. To get to the 0% tax bracket typically requires between 4 and 6 different streams of tax-free income, none of which show up on the IRS's radar, but all of which contribute to you being in the 0% tax bracket. Takeaway number 4, it used to be that people would say, hey, Dave, when are tax rates going up? I'd say in some distant, unknowable future, maybe 10 years from now, tax rates are likely to creep higher. Well, guess what? We now know the year and the day when tax rates will go up. January 1st, 2026. They will revert back to what they were in 2017, which is higher than they are today. So guess what? Every year between now and then represents a little mini window of opportunity during which to take advantage of historically low taxes. Takeaway number 5, this is all good news. How could I possibly say this? What do I mean by that? Well, let me tell you a quick story. A couple of years ago, a lady comes up to me. She says, hey, Dave, now I'm in a really bad mood. And I said, why is that? And she says, because I've got all my eggs in the tax-deferred bucket. And I said, let me get this straight. You contributed money to the tax-deferred bucket at a period in time when tax rates were dramatically higher than they are today. You got a deduction of those higher tax rates for doing so. You now have a 6-year period of time, well, back then it was an 8-year period of time, during which to take advantage of historically low tax rates. And every year that goes by where you fail to take advantage of those historically low tax rates is a missed opportunity. Why not take advantage of this period of time during which to systematically get those tax-deferred assets shifted to tax-free so that by the time tax rates potentially double over time, you've done all the heavy lifting, and then you can take those dollars out tax-free? And she says, well, gosh, Dave, I never really thought about it that way. So folks, how's the story going to end for you? Well, I would submit that so long as you take advantage of the next 6 years of historically low tax rates, that you get to determine how much of your hard-earned money you get to spend. Well, folks, one of the great things that your advisor is going to do for you is what I call that before and after comparison, just like we did with Mr. and Mrs. Jones. Only your before and after comparison is going to have 3 different projections. The first projection says, if you keep on doing exactly what you're doing and you don't change a thing and tax rates stay about where they are today, how long will your money last? They will let you know when your money will run out. And then they're going to run a second comparison that says, if you keep on doing exactly what you're doing and tax rates double, how much sooner will your money run out? And guess what? A plot spoiler here, runs out about 12 to 15 years faster. What's the third projection says that if you implement all of the recommendations that they suggest that you implement, they get you at or near the 0% tax bracket, potentially get your Social Security tax-free. How much longer will your money last? And guess what, folks? If your money lasts 5 to 7 years longer, you spend an extra $1.5 million in the process, I think at that point, it's probably worth looking into. So you will have the opportunity to discuss these options with your advisor by clicking on the right-hand side of your screen to book a complimentary phone consultation. At that point, you and your advisor can discuss the comparison I talked about in today's webinar. Thank you, everybody, for joining me today.